Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to class today. Thank you for joining me. Whether you're watching live or you're watching the recording, I just appreciate watching. So today we're going to have a little bit of fun with just writing some code, working with JSON. We're actually going to work with an API as well. So I've got a JSON file that I want to work with today, just to do a little bit of demonstration with, and I have an API file that I want to work with, and we're just going to write some code today. Just kind of as an extension of the little shorter video that I posted on Friday. Just another example, another demonstration of kind of what we're working with, kind of what we're doing. Because this all goes together, right? So, you know, the idea of working with JavaScript objects leads to working with JSON, leads to working with APIs, because a lot of APIs are based in JSON, because JSON is actually intercommunicable, right? So like I can use JSON, which is, you know, JSON, JSON, stands for JavaScript object notation, but I also have means of bringing in files that are written in JSON into Python programs, into Java programs, into various other applications. So oftentimes we see APIs that are written in JSON. So this helps bridge us from the idea of JavaScript objects on into JSON files, which we're going to have a look at first today, on into APIs. And I got a bit of a fun API I want to use today. So we're just going to do a little bit of programming, a little bit of coding today, just to get us to where we want to go, and just write some code and try to get some things that will help us here, help us get to where we want to go. Now, one of the things that I want to kind of keep in mind as you are doing this is you are probably going to want to use live server or something like that as you're doing these projects. Because one of the things that you'll notice as we're working with JSON is that we'll be using an HTTP request, right? We'll be using an HTTP request to pull files and to do, you know, various things. So if everything's done locally, it might cause some issues if things aren't done via the internet. So one of the things that I do to kind of ease having these problems is I like to put my JSON files on GitHub, which is where I'm at here to get us started. Right, I have a JSON file here on GitHub. One of the issues is, though, that I can't use this GitHub page to get them, right? This is my standard repo page to just this JSON file that I've written here. It's a very simple JSON file. We'll look at the structure of it in just a moment. But one of the easiest ways that I can use a JSON file from GitHub is to upload or create my JSON file on GitHub. And then from the repo page, you'll notice this raw button right here. RAW, this raw button. Right here, you'll see it's on the same line here as this edit button. Drop this down, I can edit file and do some various things. If I click that raw button, then that actually gives me a link to the raw file. And I can actually use this raw file link here in my project, which we'll see in just a moment. And so now let's examine the structure of this JSON. All right, so what you can see here in this JSON is basically an array of JavaScript objects, right? We see that I start out with these square brackets. And then inside of these square brackets, I have my objects. And this is written kind of using that object literal notation that we talked about at the beginning of the last live class, which, you know, is different from the, you know, functional object notation that we looked at it toward the end of the last live class. So we can see here, you know, this is just some class information. right? I have a course ID, I have a course name, I have an instructor name, and I have a level here. And the level could just be, any sort of descriptor. Writing the same thing below just for another class. And so, a couple of things to notice here is where the commas are. If you put a comma after the last one here, it's going to expect another item. So we want to make sure to not put a comma after the last item in your object. And we do have a comma in between our objects because it is basically an array of objects, right? So, we can see that as we're kind of dealing with it here, right? Square brackets, curly brackets inside of square brackets. These are all the sort of structures that we've been dealing with so far, right? So this is all the sort of thing that we've been doing. So in and of itself, right, like this is pretty standard based on, kind of what we know up to this point about objects and about arrays. Right, so all we have here is just a little bit of a different, we have a different function that we need to use to be able to bring this file into our JSON or into our JavaScript file. But then once we bring it in, we can basically use it just like we would use any other bit of, JavaScript object or anything that we've been using throughout the entire semester. All right, so let's get Visual Studio Code here and let's create a new project. I don't have a folder for this made yet, so let's open up our terminal. Let's make a folder for this. So let's navigate to our E drive, which is where I keep everything. We'll cd into Web215, which is my folder for this class. We'll make a directory for... Let's see, we'll call this JSON Fa22. And then we'll cd into that folder. cd JSON. And if I didn't already have code open, I could open it from here. In fact, I'll just go ahead and do that. We'll just run code period and we'll open another instance of code in that folder. And I'll just close my first instance of code there. Yes, so it'll have the file open by default. Let me just navigate to that folder in another window, in an Explorer window as well, just so you all can see that. Web215, JSON Fa22, there it is. We'll bring that over. And we'll add for the time being, we'll add our index.html. And we will add our script.js. Go ahead and put our HTML skeleton in here using our exclamation point and emit. Add a title, JSON example, and we'll add the script link to the body of the site here. Script src equals script.js and close script. And again, if we look in that folder now, we see those two files ready to go, ready to do business for us. If we were to open this with Live Server, it's a blank page, which is all well and good because what I want to do is I want to copy and paste. Or I just want to copy for the time being. I want to copy the URL to the raw.github user content for my JSON file here. And so the first thing that I want to do in my JavaScript file here is I want to create a variable where I can put that URL, right? So if you took the time to watch that shorter video I posted last Friday, you've already seen me do an example similar to this. This is just going to be, kind of refresher and kind of a different way to do it. Right, so I'm going to create, and let me zoom in here so we can see this a little bit better. We'll create a constant because this URL won't be changing. And we just give this a variable name. We'll call this RURL for request URL. And we'll set it equal to that URL from the GitHub, the raw URL. We know we have the right one here if it ends in soul.json and starts in with raw dot. Right, and we'll end with our semicolon. So what we need to do is we need to use the XML HTTP request library, which is built in JavaScript, to be able to allow our browser to make a request to this URL to get this data and bring it back. And believe it or not, the XML HTTP request library is an object unto itself, right? Because, really what we want to do is we want to be able to make an instance of this request in memory that we can use to actually take our data. Right, so I'm going to create some variable. We'll call it request, because that's what we're doing here. We're going to be sending a request to this server to get this URL, to get this data sent back to us. And it'll be a new XML HTTP request object. Don't forget the parentheses there on the end. And then that has some items associated with it. Let me see if I can just pull up the documentation for this object, just so you all can look at it by default, just so we can see what's going on here. This is just allowing us to retrieve data from a URL without, going to that page or doing anything with that page. It's just allowing our browser to get that data and bring it back. And we can see here in this documentation the kind of things that we need. Right? There's a response. We can figure that we're going to need a response. We got a response type here, specifying the type of response, since we are going to be bringing back specifically JSON data. We're going to need that as well. There's a lot of other stuff here that we can, kind of look through specifically for our purposes. All we really need to make this work is our open, which is going to initialize our request. That's what's going to actually send our request out. We can have a look at that. Ideally, we need a method and a URL, but we can actually go even further with this if we want to. Right, because you can see we can use a username and password to be able to access data on the other end. Right, but since this data in particular is just available on the open web, right, we just go to this website and get it. We don't need any of that. So we're just going to need a method and a URL. Now the methods that we're talking about here are get, post, put, and delete, which is our standard HTTP request methods. Now post and put are send methods. Delete is a delete method. So the only return method here is a get method. So we're going to use our get method on our request URL to be able to get our file back. So we're going to go to request.open, and we are going to get our R URL. That's going to initiate our request when things happen. We're going to tell it that it's going to have a request.response type of JSON. So it can know the type of data that it's going to be expecting back and have everything formatted accordingly. So when we get the data back, it's going to a JSON file. When we get the data back, we're going to be getting back JSON data. Now, when we look at our response type here, which we saw here in our documentation, we see that we can get different types of data here. We can get binary large objects, array buffers, empty string, which is just text, document, which is going to be HTML, JSON, which is what we're using here, or an MS stream, which is a streaming download. So we can actually also use this to get back HTML if we wanted to, or text files, or many other different types of things. So we could extend this, what we're doing here, from just working with JSON and APIs to also doing web scraping and various other types of things like that. So that, if we go to a website, we can scrape off, various types of data from that website. Maybe we can try that in another thing some other time. Right? So we know we're expecting some JSON from there. And so all we need to do then is we just need to send that request. So we're going to request.send. And remember again that the request here is built off of this new XML HTTP request. And so now what we get back, so this is basically what we need to do. Right? And once we run this, we have this request sent, and we'll get a response. We just have to be able to do something with the response. So we have to tell our browser when we want to be able to do something with the response. So we can write a little function here that's going to be request.onload, which is going to be whenever our request loads, we can just run an arrow function here. And we can console.log request.response. Show one more time how to get the link for the R URL. Yes, indeed. So I'm doing this one from GitHub. You can also do it from somewhere else. But all I did here was just upload it to a repo. So it's just a plain repo. I clicked on the file here to see the file, and then I clicked on raw here. And then that's the URL that I'm using here. So it's just a regular GitHub repo that I uploaded my JSON file to. And then I got the raw URL for that file. So it's linking to the direct file on the internet. So ideally, if you're going to do this with your file, you want it to start with raw and end with whatever your file name is, .json. But if we run this now, if we see everything, if we did everything right, since we're console logging here, and let's try to console table here and see what that does. And did that help, by the way? we will run a little console. We'll run a little console table to 10.4 to see our results. So we can, let's see here. There's our JSON example. And if I run my inspect element and look at my console, I see here that I have an array. I have two, wrong file. I meant to hit 4, not 3. And if I look at that, I can see there's my data that's been scraped from that JavaScript. From that JSON file. So now I have this data in here that I can work with, right? It's in this called request response, and it's also in where I can do things with it in request.onload. So the big trick with this comes in with the fact that I have to do everything kind of with it in request.onload. So I need to make calls to other functions from request.onload. Is what makes this just a little tricky. But it'll be fine. Now that we know, though, based on the response that we are getting from our console, because we are getting the data passing through in our response. And we see that it is labeled as an object and has all the object information here. We can start to work with it, which is pretty cool. So from here, one of the things that I might do is I might create a function. And you can create this function either way. You can create it as a regular function, which we'll do here, or you can create it as an arrow notation function that we did there. And we can call it, really whatever we want. In this instance, we'll call it class info, since this is this is about classes. And we'll want to have a parameter in our function so that we can pass in the API data. I'm going to call it data for this purpose, right? You can call it whatever you want. Call it, API data, call it JSON data, call it whatever you want to call it. I'm just going to call it data. Right, and so I know based on the way that my data is in my JSON file here, I know that in each object, I have a course name as a key with a value that goes along with it, or a course ID as a key with a value that goes along with it, a course name as a key with a value that goes along with it, an instructor name with a key with a value that goes along with it, and a level with a key with a value that goes along with it. Right, so I can use this data to help build. Right, now this is an array, so I want to write a loop, so I can write something for each item here. So if I want to loop over my entire JSON to do something for each object that's within my JSON file, I can write a for loop and just do a little enhanced for loop for d or let d of data and then I can just start to do things accordingly, right? Like we can start to add things to our document. Document dot query selector body, and we'll change this up just a little bit. In a few minutes, once we kind of see the way things can work here. Because I'm going to add another course into that file in a little bit that's going to be a different level. And we're going to do something a little bit different with it, just so we can see something kind of play out here. So document.query selector body dot inner HTML plus equals, so it just adds to what's currently there. And we will have H1 our file again has the keys of course ID and course name. So I can D dot course ID. Concatenate that with a space. Concatenate that with D dot course name. And concatenate that with my closing H1 tag. So now if I call this function with the data that I'm using as the parameter, so we'd basically change this to class info dot request dot response. Then on our output page, we would see CIS 110 Introduction to Computers, Bio 275, Microbiology. Right, just like that. You know, just built off of this code here. And so we can extend this or contract this, you know, however we want. Based on whatever. You know, let's put a colon in here if we want to, right? We can put a colon in here where we put that concatenated space. And that will allow us to separate the names from the ID numbers. If we put, you know, CSS in here, CSS would work accordingly, right? And I haven't really written a ton of code here, right? And, you know, we'd be able to edit this JSON file and update it with new information. And it would be able to update our code accordingly. For example, we could do that, right? I can click this pencil here to go into edit mode. We'll copy one of these, put a little comma there. Paste that. Let's add one for Web 215. This is advanced markup and scripting. this is my course. And let's put this one at gold level instead of platinum level. And we'll commit the changes. Right, our raw file doesn't change. Right, our URL to our raw file doesn't change. So you can see this might be an easy way where you could have somebody update a website if they don't know a whole lot about HTML, CSS, that sort of thing, right? You can have them update a file that, you know, just has a little bit of information on it. If we go to our JSON example here, it might take a little bit for it to kind of go through and realize that it's updated. Or it might require us to make a change to the code here to be, because it needs to kind of reload, make another request to this. But it's also GitHub, so it might take a minute to realize that that the change has been made. And it also just might be cached. So let's try to and I bet what we could do too is we could do that, and we could do it'll work eventually. It's GitHub. It's GitHub, so GitHub's probably a little bit slow about getting that propagation out to it. But we can see that happening. Right, and we could also put a little bit of information here about, you know, whatever we want to put some information about. For example, if I wanted a paragraph that had instructor name in it, we could add a little paragraph here, concatenate that with D dot. Let's see, we called that instructor underscore name. Concatenate that. And actually, I'd want like instructor name colon space. And then concatenate that with a closing paragraph tag. So we can see that little bit. On our website. And so now for a moment, let's pretend like I'm going to work with this, and I'm going to make multiple objects that are going to have multiple let me rephrase, I need to have multiple areas where I can put multiple of these courses. And you know, that's why, you know, GitHub being a little slow for me here right now in terms of propagating that out is causing a little bit of trouble. Oh, there it is. There it is. It showed up. I knew it would eventually. There it is. So I'd like to create different sections now. one for platinum, and one for gold, because we have some of these that are platinum and some of these that are gold. And so this should kind of give you an idea about, how to put things into different departments when you're thinking about that. So when I look in here, I can create an array. Right, and I can create an array for status. Right, so we'll call this one, it'll be const status, or we'll call it const stat, and we'll set it equal to an array, and we'll make the tags here match what we have in our JSON file. So we have uppercase P and uppercase G. So we have platinum, and we have gold. So what I can do is I can write I can write a little function, or I can write an array, basically kind of whatever I want to do that would work to address this. One of the things that we might want to do is do this first. One of the things that I might do to kind of make sure my order of operations happens the way I want it to happen is actually do it in my class info function here, right? And just make it all of one function. Right, so, I can write a new array that's like for let I of stat. I can create a section and I'm not going to use, I can create a section in the body that has an item with this class in it, right? So we can do that. And I'm actually going to use the tick mark pretty formatting for this just because I think it's going to make things a little bit easier. Right, so that's going to be tick marks instead of quotes here. And we're going to say section, section, class equals, single quote, $, curly brace, I, close curly brace, close quote, and then close section. And then one of the things that I would want to do here is I just want to put it in the class that goes, of course, since I have these two classes here, I can put it in the class that corresponds with the level. So D dot, and this would be $, D dot level, since we're using ticks here. So I have this period here. That would be the period to represent class. Using ticks instead of quotes. So I can use this $ curly brace symbology just to make life a little bit easier. And so now I should have two sections, one for platinum, one for gold. My platinum should have 2 items in it. My gold should have 1 item in it. So if I look at my JSON here, or if I look at my website here, not much should have changed. But if I look at my page source here, or actually if I look at my inspect element here, it's what I'm going to want to do instead. you'll see I have a section called Platinum here. And inside it, I have Introduction to Computers with my name and Microbiology with Brandon Adair's name and the close tag for that section. And I have another section here for Gold that has the other class in it. And we could actually make that even more clear if we added a CSS file here. So let's add a style.css. In our header here, we'll add a link href equals style.css, rel equals style sheet. And we'll make the dot platinum have a padding of 12 pixels and a border of 3px solid and like a light blue kind of gray. So let's go for like hashtag CCCCFF. And let's make that an even thicker border. And we'll do the same thing for gold. We'll just change the color of the border. And this will be, instead of that light blue, it'll be gold. So we'll go for a, let's see, I want it a little more. So I want it to be like AA 9933 would be a good kind of gold color there. All right, and so there we can see those borders clearly defined there. We could also adjust the widths accordingly, right? And so we could do it on both of them if we just applied it to the section tag. Like so. And so now we can clearly see that the items that are in that department or that have that level are wrapped in our blue border, whereas the items that have the gold level are wrapped in the gold border, right? Which show us how we can kind of use the things from the last 2 weeks together to do some really cool, really interesting, really fun stuff with this. Right, and so that's basically how we take, if we can kind of combine these two things, that basically more or less gives you the skills that you'd want to be able to complete your lab, right? You're just putting the pertinent data into the right place here. One of the things that we see is that, you can put this sort of information inside of anything, right? So even if I had like URLs to images on my Cloudinary that I put into a file like this, then it would just be, then I would just be putting, IMG SR, I could put that into image tags. And get images that way. Right, so I could actually get images into a website that way as well. Right, so this is just, one of those kind of simple examples that we can use to be able to kind of do this. And we can extend this into APIs. And so you kind of saw a brief example of an API. In that example that I showed you all on Friday, I wanted to show you all kind of another example of an API today using Poke API. Poke API is the Pokemon-based API, and it has API data for all of the Pokemon. And so I put in API data, or I put in the API here to get data for my favorite Pokemon, Mudkip. All right, so I put in Mudkip here, and I hit submit, and I can copy the Mudkip link to my clipboard there. And so now I can basically do the same sort of process that we just did. We can make another, since this is an object, we can make another request for that, and it'll just create another instance of that in memory. Right, so I can make a const here called p URL for Pokemon URL and set it equal to that URL that I got from the Poke API. And if I look at the Poke API, this is what I get if I go to that URL that the Poke API gives me. And it's not formatted here, but once we see it, it actually is. It's JSON based, right? This is JSON. And so it is code that we can access in the same sort of way. So I'm just going to create a var p request here for Pokemon request. And set it equal to a new XML HTTP request. And then we can do the same thing we were doing here. P request dot open get P URL P request dot response type equals JSON. P request dot send then I can make a P request dot onload, set that equal to my arrow notation function here, and I can console log my P request dot response just to see that. And so if we look at that here, and we look on our site here, if I look at my console here, I see that I have an object here, and I can expand it, and I can see all of my data from my Poke API. And the call here is a little bit different because instead of just having a simple array, it's just a simple object of items. So I have these key value pairs, right? We see that it's just a singular object instead of multiple objects, even though some of these objects have arrays inside of them. But for example, I could do something like call this sprites object and get, say, the shiny URL from it. So front shiny. So let's try that. So let's write a function. We'll call it show shiny. We'll pass our data into it. Remember, parameters are scoped to the function, so I can use the same parameter for different functions. And in this instance, I can document.query selector body dot inner HTML plus equals. I'm going to put it in an image tag. So let's use our backticks here just so we can use the $ type formatting here. Let's see, it's img src equals $ curly braces. If we look at our console, we see that the shiny is in sprites front shiny. So that's going to be in data dot sprites. And I think we might be able to get this from dot front shiny. Since that's not an array, that's just a list of key value pairs. So I think we should be able to put dot front underscore shiny here and be able to get that out of there so we wouldn't have to do anything else with that. So if we save that and look on our site now, we need to call this function. So let's change console.log here to show shiny instead of console.log. And there he is. Right there. So we're able to take other data from a website that exists that's sharing their data through a RESTful API and work with that data to be able to put it onto our websites. And so that's how basically, a simple open API works. And I encourage you all to, take something like the one that I demonstrated in the video that I put out on Friday. That one was, I believe, Open API, which is a good one. Let me pull that one up really quickly. Using Open API here is really good. To be able to figure stuff out or be able to use something like Poke API. Right, like if you could kind of use Poke API to kind of figure out how to make a Pokemon card. Right, because all that data is in there. Like if we look at this file here, like it shows you moves and it shows you health and it gives you a picture and all. So if you kind of revisit like the Web 115 stuff that many of you did a long, long time ago, one of the things that we did in there was we made a card. One of the interesting things that you might want to try to do, and this kind of breaks it down a little bit easier, makes it a little bit easier to read. One of the things that might be interesting for you to try to do is to try to make a card now using Poke API to call your data, which would be an interesting and fun thing to do. So, as always, and if you have any questions, go ahead and put them in the chat now. I'm sure there might be one or two out there because we covered some heavy stuff today. Lots of big stuff. And as you're preparing those, I'll just say, as always, I will be adding these files to my GitHub and including them when I send out the recording today. So you'll have those to reference. But I think, when you combine this to, what we did last time and what we did in the last module, should be, relatively simple to kind of build upon. What you're doing there and working it out. So with that being said, that's roughly our hour for today. Question? Still a bit lost on connecting the JSON file, but we'll get together after class. Okay. Okay, that's doable. All right, well, if there aren't any other questions, then we can go ahead and we can wrap things up so I can get to your question off stream. If anybody who is watching the recording has any questions, please send me an email or a Teams message with your question. Thank you for watching, and we will see you next time.